This is your 20th lesson. Starts out with the indicative perfect passive. The indicative perfect passive, as usual, you have your mood, your tense, and your voice. In order to conjugate the indicative perfect passive, you take the fourth principal part. Now you have to know that the fourth principal part has a masculine, a feminine, and a neuter form. So you have to decide whether the subject of the sentence is masculine, in which case you take the masculine form only. If it's a feminine subject, you take the feminine form only. And if it's neuter, of course, you take the neuter form. So there are three options for that fourth principal part, but you have to know if the I of the sentence, as in I see the girl, is a man, then you have to take the masculine form of I. If the I in the sentence is a female, then you have to take the feminine form, and so forth and so on. He, she, and it is obvious. You choose masculine, feminine, or neuter for he, she, or it. But you have to remember it's not all three forms of the fourth principal part, just one. And then you also have to remember that for the singular, you take the singular form of that adjective, that fourth principal part. When it's plural, we, you all, and they, you make it plural. Now, if that explanation doesn't make that much sense in words, it will once we do it in practice. But understand and pause the recording now if you don't quite follow me. You have a fourth principal part that looks something like amatus, amata, and amatum. Now, if it's masculine, I'm going to choose the amatus form only and forget about amata and amatum. For the first person singular, I, and the second person singular, you, and the third person, in this case, he, because it's masculine only, I'm going to keep amatus as the form. But when we get into the plural, we, you all, and they, then I'm going to go to the plural form of amatus for we is going to be in the masculine, amati, because it declines just like a regular adjective, bonas, bonam, bonam. And for y'all, it's going to be amati, and for they, it's going to be amati. I'll show you again in more detail what these, what the forms look like, but you need to understand this point now before I go any further. You get the fourth principal part, but the fourth principal part comes in three forms. You have to choose singular or plural, and masculine or feminine. Once you've gone through that first phase of making decisions, you then take the form, let's say it's feminine, amata, and then you add sum. Specifically, you put a space in between the word amata and sum. Then you take amata for the second person singular, and you add s. Again, there's going to be a space, that's an underscore that I'm drawing in there. You don't have to write the underscore, obviously. I just want to emphasize that there's a space between those two words. You don't add it directly to the amata. And then you would add amata est, and so forth and so on. And again, this is the singular form, and it's feminine. And then we got to the plural form, we would have the plural feminine form, amatai sumus, and it would continue amatai, amatai, sumus, estis, and then sunt. That's an example in the feminine. Singular up top, the first three, plural on the bottom. This is the feminine form, singular, and the bottom is the feminine form, plural. Again, this is a good time to pause that recording, make sure you understand these steps, and then I'll show you more detailed examples printed so it may be easier to read. So here it is in the masculine, feminine, neuter. If you have a masculine subject, you choose amatus in the singular and amati for the plural. If you have a feminine subject, you choose amata for the singular and amatai for the plural. Neuter subject, amatam, amatam, amatam. Plural, amata, amata, amata. Then you add sum for the first person singular, es, est, sumus, estis, and sunt. You translate it in the following way. Amatis sum would mean I have been loved, and the I has to be a man, has to be something masculine, a boy, whatever it is. If it's amata sum, the second variety, it would again be translated as I have been loved, but you'll know specifically that the I is a female or a feminine subject. And again, down here, you could say I have been loved. The I would have to be a thing in that case. You'd have to be personifying an object to say amatum sum. So it can be amatus sum, or amatum sum, depending on what the subject is. Same thing for the second one, amatus s. You have been loved, but we know because you've chosen amatus s that that's the masculine variety. Down here, it would be the same thing. You have been loved, but the you is a female. In the neuter category, it would be the neuter you. Obviously, he, she, and it is easiest. He has been loved, she has been loved, it has been loved. And then you go on through the rest of the declension, or conjugation rather. We have been loved, you all have been loved, they have been loved. That's the indicative, perfect, passive system. Not surprisingly, the next form that you would learn is the indicative pluperfect passive. Pluperfect instead of perfect. Again, you take the fourth principal part, you choose the masculine, feminine, or neuter, depending on what the subject is. You use the singular or you use the plural. And then instead of adding sum, est, sumus, estis, sunt, you add eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, erant. Not difficult to predict that. Again, if it were neuter, I would start out with amatum, and then I would put a space, and then eram. That's for the singular, and then amatum eras, and amatum erat. For the plural, I would start over, and I have to have the plural form of the fourth principal part, amata, and then I would put eramus, eratus, and erant. That's the indicative pluperfect passive. Here's the way it would look for a masculine, feminine, or neuter subject. Masculine, amatus eram, amatus eras, amatus erat, amati eramus, amati eratus, amati erant. Feminine, I didn't write it all out, I abbreviated it, but you get the point. Amata, 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 amatai, 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 eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, erant. Same thing, amatum, 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 amata, amata, amata for the plural, and eram, eras, erat, eramus, eratus, erant. The translation is just like you would do a pluperfect, except you're doing it in the passive voice. I had, that's the pluperfect in English, I had been loved, you had been loved, he had been loved, that's the masculine category. The feminine, I had been loved, you had been loved, she had been loved. And then the neuter, I had been loved, you had been loved, it had been loved. And of course, in the feminine variety, you know that the I, or the you, is a girl or a female of some sort. And in the masculine category, the I and the you are male subjects. Nothing surprising if you understood the first part, the indicative perfect passive. The indicative pluperfect passive follows regular patterns that you've already learned to recognize. Next is the indicative, sorry I cut and pasted there, future perfect. You could probably have predicted that without me even writing this. The indicative future perfect passive. I've always taught them in the same order. The perfect, the pluperfect, and then last, the future perfect. Future perfect involves the same steps. Take the fourth principal part, choose masculine, feminine, or neuter. After you choose masculine or feminine or neuter, choose the singular or the plural. And then instead of adding the sum or the eram, very predictably, you add ero, eris, erit, erimus, eritus, erunt. Note that that is erunt, which is really what you've been accustomed to. You have seen E-R-I-N-T, but in this case it's E-R-U-N-T. That's something that has to be memorized. In each instance, it is in regularity. Again, if it were masculine, you would take the fourth principal part, amatus, In this case, I've chosen the amatis, and then I add a space, and ero, erisarit, erimis, eritis, erint. Once I get to the plural, I have to make it masculine plural, so it's amati. And the first plural form is we. And then you just continue in the same fashion. Nothing surprising, challenging, or crazy about that. Here's a detailed example of what it looks like in the masculine, feminine, and neuter forms. The masculine form amatis, 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 followed by amati, amati, amati. Ero, erisarit, erimis, eritis, erunt. It translates as I will have been loved. I will have been loved, I will have been loved. You will have been loved, you will have been loved, you will have been loved. And then it gets very clear, he will have been loved, she will have been loved, or it will have been loved. Of course, it continues in the plural. We will have been loved, you all will have been loved, we, you all, and they will have been loved. Very simple, the same every single time, same general patterns, fourth principal part, plus a form of the verb to be. Next topic is the words, the form idem, iadem, or idem, which translates as the same. It literally means the same. It's very similar to the forms that you've already learned before, is, ia, and id, except it adds this suffix dem to the end of it. Note that the dem suffix does not change, it does not decline. This word can be used as a pronoun, or it can be used as an adjective, so it does decline, but the dem doesn't decline. The first part of the word, the is, ia, id-like part, declines. Again, if that doesn't make sense by me describing it in words, it will make sense when we do it in practice, when you actually see how it works. I gave you two examples that I'll show you again when we're finished with it of how to translate it. Once as a pronoun, you would say something like idem, which would translate in English awkwardly, the same is my friend. Now I chose the masculine version, so I put man in parentheses, but Latin doesn't need to say the word man. Latin can just say idem is my friend. In English, you'd have to say the same man is my friend. So the word can be used to stand on behalf of a noun, which is what a pronoun does, or it can be used as an adjective. For example, we saw you at the same time, where same is modifying the word time. It's the adjective describing time. So it can be used to stand on behalf of a noun, the same is my friend, the same man in this case, or it can be used as the adjective. Here's how it declines. It has to be memorized like so many of these forms, like is, I, and id itself. Now it drops the is, but note that dem does not decline. Is, I, id plus dem. In this case, the id drops the first d. I should have put the line there. So it's like is, I, and id, but not exactly the same. Now in the genitive, it is very predictable. Eus plus the dem, which never changes. Eus dem, eus dem, eus dem. Then ei dem, ei dem. I'm just emphasizing the pronunciation there. It's pronounced adem, adem, adem. And then iundem. Now if it were is, I, id, you would expect eum plus dem. But the n before the d changes it into an n in Latin. That's just the way their language tends to mutate words. Again, ion dem and edem, because the nominative and accusative for all neuters are always exactly the same. And then you have iodem, iadem, and iodem. The dem never changes. The is, I, id part does change. And just remember, it's not exactly the same as is, I, id. Adem, iadem, iadem, eorun. There's the n again. If it were is, I, id, it'd be eorum with an m. Eorum and eorundem. Eistem, eistem, eistem. Eostem, eastem, iadem. And eistem, eistem, eistem. A matter of sitting down with the book or sitting down with this lesson that I post on the website under lessons in print form, or looking at this screencast, writing these down, making flashcards, and practicing them, because this is not easy to memorize. It's even more complicated, perhaps, because you've already memorized is, ia, and id. Take a look at it again. Copying it down has been shown to improve your ability to remember things. If you're not taking notes during these screencasts, I would argue that you're doing it wrong. You're going to improve your ability to retain information and the quickness with which you learn, most people will at least, by writing things down as you watch these lessons. Watch them, rewind them, take notes, and then, of course, ask me when you have questions. I have to admit, I get very few questions, and that must mean the podcasts are absolutely perfect and the best lessons they could possibly be, or people just aren't asking questions, not taking the time to do better. And if you're not taking the time to ask me questions, there's no reason that you can criticize my presentation of the material, because I don't have your feedback to improve it. I don't know what's not being communicated well, so please ask me those questions. Give me your honest critique, and obviously I want to hear that in a positive way so that you're not putting me off, but I obviously want to improve this. So give me your feedback, ask me questions so I know how to make these perfect or make them better. Now here are those two sentences I gave you above in English. The same man is my friend. I don't say the same, I don't need the word man there. I just say the same est amicus meus. The same is my friend. But in Latin, because this is masculine singular, it makes it very clear that I'm talking about the same masculine singular thing is my friend. My assumption would be the masculine singular thing would be a man or a person. Down here, so that's the use as a pronoun. And then down here, videmus te eodem tempore. We see you at the same time, and in this case, eodem is modifying tempore. So it's an adjective modifying a noun, and it's in the same case number and gender as tempore, which is the ablative singular neuter. Deponent verbs are funny kinds of verbs. Deponere means to lay aside. Deponent verbs are only conjugated in the passive. So people say that they lay aside their active forms. But it's funny because they look to your eye, they're spelled and pronounced as if they were in the passive voice, and yet you translate them only in the active voice. So they lose their passive meaning even though they are conjugated as if they were passives. Again, I'm going to have to show you examples probably to make that clear. But it's very easy to do deponent verbs. You conjugate them like any other passive verb form, and you've learned all the passive verb forms now. There's nothing irregular about their actual conjugation. It's just that they never appear, they never are conjugated in an active form. And yet, they're always translated as if they're active. So they look to your eye and they sound to your ear passive, but they are translated as if they were active. Look passive and they act as if they're active. They're translated as if they're active. It's a funny combination. Look at the examples. The verb conor. You'll note that the principal parts are already funny looking because there is no fourth principal part essentially. There's a first, a second, and then what looks like the fourth principal part appears in the third slot. Conatus, conata, conatum sum. This is just like the form you learned in this same lesson. Be sum es est, sumus estis sunt. You'd add to the fourth principal part. You'd choose the masculine, the feminine, or the neuter. It only has three principal parts, and the first principal part is not end with an O like you're used to. It ends with an OR, which is the passive form. And yet, you don't translate it passively, you translate it as if it were active. Conor, for example, would translate as the word I try. The canare right here is the infinitive present passive. It's translated, though, as if it means to try in the active voice. And again, conatus sum would translate as I have tried. Translated as if it were active. And yet to your eye, it looks like you've just conjugated a passive verb. Again, look at very, or the principal parts, only 3 principal parts. And it doesn't mean I am feared, that would be the passive voice. It translates as if it were an active verb, I fear. Same thing, instead of I am spoken, or he is spoken about, it translates as speak, loquor, loqui, locutus, locuta, locutum sum. All the forms appear to your eye as if they were passive. The principal parts right there all look passive, and yet the verb is translated as if it were active. Looks passive, translates active. So look at a synopsis of the verb conator. The first form is the indicative present active. That looks like, and that's the third person singular, that looks like it's an indicative present passive. And yet you translate it as he tries. Not in the passive voice, even though it looks and is spelled and is pronounced as if it were the passive form. That's essentially what a deponent verb is. I suppose I should really identify this not as the indicative present active, but as the indicative present deponent. It's a funny combination of the two. In Greek, they usually describe this as the middle voice. So you have the active, passive, and middle voice. It's probably a better way to describe it, really. Look at conabitur. This is the indicative imperfect deponent. Third singular. It looks as if it were a passive verb because it has the tur ending, and yet it's translated actively. He used to try. Same thing with conabitur. Has a passive ending, and yet it's translated actively. He will try. Conatus sum looks like the forms you learned in the first part of this lesson. In that case, it should be translated as he has been tried, but instead it says he has tried. Active translation. Active translation, active translation. Let me make sure you know what each one is. This is the indicative future in the deponent voice, third person singular. He will try. This is the indicative perfect, deponent voice, third singular. This is the indicative pluperfect, deponent, third singular. He had tried. And then finally the indicative future perfect, deponent voice, third person singular. He will have tried. Each of them translates as if they were active. So when you come across a deponent verb and it looks passive to your eye, how do you know? You should actually translate certain verbs as if they were active. Because when you see them and they look passive, you'll probably assume that they're passive. The only way to do it is to memorize the list of deponent verbs. You probably will not be able to memorize every single deponent verb in the Latin language, but make sure you know the ones that appear in the chapter so it makes it easier for you. You could probably figure it out by trial and error. It just won't make sense if you translate these words passively. But better to memorize the very relatively few words that you come across in the book that are deponent and memorize them so that when you see them, you remember, oh yeah, this looks like it's passive, but I need to translate it as if it were active. Tricky lesson, but you'll get used to it. One more relatively simple point, it's the use of the so-called reflexive pronoun. Reflexive means it turns back upon itself. When you're using the third person subject he, she, or it, and the he, she, or it acts upon itself, you do not use is, ia, and id. But instead you use the following forms. There's no nominative. Sui, sibi, say, or say, whichever one you prefer. And then again, for the ablative, say or say. And that's the same for the singular and plural. Singular and plural forms are exactly the same. And there's never any need for a nominative reflexive, so you just don't have one. So instead of using is, ia, id, When you want to emphasize himself, herself, itself, or themselves, you use sui, sibi, say. So look at this example. Arachne say doket. Arachne teaches herself. That's a different sentence than if you said Arachne ayam doket. That's is id right here. Ayam. It's the accusative singular feminine form of it. Instead of saying Arachne teaches her, you want to say Arachne teaches herself. So the sui, sibi, say adds the self to that word. Look at the next example. The man was killed by himself. The man was killed, est nakatus, by or ab, in this case it's say. The man was killed by himself. Arachne teaches herself. If I put is id in this sentence, the wir ab eo nakatus est. If I put is id, in this case eo, that would mean the man was killed by him. But I want to say the man was killed by himself. I want to make it reflexive. I want to make this refer back to the subject. I want to make herself refer back to the subject. That's what reflexivity means. Look at the last example. The femini say laudant. The women praise themselves. There's the self again. If I use the women praise eos instead of say, eos is the id form, it would mean the women praise them. But I want to say the women praise themselves. So you got to use the sui, sibi, say form instead. That's the end of the podcast. Please Skype me with any questions.